Thank you very much. And thank you all for having me back. So today I am going to be talking about what I refer to as the bonfire of the profanities. When you work in this industry for 25 plus years...
No.
Hey, I got gray. Let me see here. I was told I had to do that. Didn't think that was going to happen, did you? All right. So this is one of those things. He is actually quite evil because... He's got to turn it on first. Yeah, step forward on. Because I can't hold still. And there's no remote mic, so I have to, if I start walking around, I'm going to do a whole Alex Hutton, and I'm not going to do that today. But I am Dave Lewis, and you can find me on Twitter as Gattaca, because I've been told I should do that at the beginning of a talk, so there you go, if you want to have horrible things happen to you. I like to go around the world and giving talks at lots of conferences, because I like to share the stories that, yeah, okay, I'll just keep going. So this is my third time here. Now, the first time I was here to talk about the attackers, the people that are trying to break into your systems. That was called Barbarians at the Gateway. Last year I came back and I was talking about once they got in, the attackers in the throne room. And now here I am talking about trust. Specifically, zero trust. And if I could have a show of hands of how many people are sick and tired of hearing that term. Excellent. I'm going to put it in terms of risk and the things that we should have been doing for the last 30 years. But before I get into that, the reason I talk about the profanities is because in this industry we do tend to swear a lot. And oddly enough, apparently it's rather beneficial and even healthy for you to swear your head off. Now, because my boss asked me nicely to not get too dark onto the profanities, I have pulled it back a little bit, but the good people at Effin' Birds have allowed me to have Effin' Birds in my presentation, so I'm quite happy about that because they are Canadian. Oddly enough, so am I. To clear up a couple of things, I brought this up the first time I gave a talk here. We are not all lumberjacks, but some of us do have a very inherent interest in law and order and things to that effect. Hello, Mick. And, I'll tell you what it's all about, but first we'll get right to it. So what's the big idea? When we're talking about zero trust, we are talking about reducing the risk, reducing that surface so that the attackers can't get away with horrible things. And that's because we talk about things like the perimeter. Oh, I have a firewall. Everything is fine. I literally sat in a meeting after a penetration test where the CIO looked at me and said, it's okay, we have a firewall. Meanwhile, the penetration testers had a nice thick report like that. They had completely compromised everything. The perimeter is not what it used to be. So that idea is very much a deprecated notion. And we have to look at things as anywhere an access decision is being made. Because the attackers are going to do all sorts of horrible things to your network. They're going to get in through all manner of things. When part of my career, I got to do some penetration testing, and I got into systems that I couldn't believe I got into. I was working for the Defense Department in the United States at one point as a contractor. They didn't seem to care I was Canadian. And in one system, they brought it out, and they said, look, we want you to break into this. This was the sponsor for this program. He sat me down in front of a keyboard. I had never seen this system before, and it had some brass from the military standing behind and said, try and break into it. Oddly enough, there is a default username and password that this particular branch of the military uses on all of their systems when they're in test. Well, that worked. I got in, and I said, where would you like me to send your Bradley fighting vehicle, sir? He went, closed the laptop, took it, and walked out, and that was the last I heard of that particular conversation. And the thing is any attack that you see today is pretty much going to look like they're supposed to be there. If you're reading all sorts of reports, they're talking about it's at least 200 days in many cases before you even notice that an attacker is in your network. Reports like Pokemon and things like that. And as you're going through, you have to actually take away what is the rationale here. If your system is attacked, even if they're in there for an hour, think of the damage they can do to your network. So you have to make sure that you're managing the holes in your network. There are all sorts of them coming in. You have VPN, email, remote desktop protocol, which we heard about earlier today, and oddly enough, duo.com, we can fix that. DNS. Oh my God, I managed a split horizon DNS for a company back in 2006-ish. Wow, it is so easy for things to go terribly, terribly wrong. But we also have to consider web traffic. You have all this web traffic going in and out of your network, and you have to look at it. It's like, what are we doing to make sure that we're taking care of that low-hanging fruit? Because the attackers are going to go after that. They don't have to burn a 0 day to get into your network. if you have a default username and password. We heard about earlier when Emma was giving her talk about the administrative credentials on that particular system where it was admin. Oddly enough, it was actually not just one country, it was actually roughly about 26 countries, where that portal was available, where you could get the exact same data that the attackers apparently got through the website. This is the kind of thing that leads me to profanity. Because when you have the attackers are able to get into your systems with very, very simple things that we should have been able to fix, this drives me absolutely to distraction. And I tend to break a lot of walls. Thankfully, I have what I refer to as the Lewis skull, which, my wife's not too happy about that because my kids have it as well. This is exactly how I tend to react. The perimeter is not what we used to think of it as. There's all sorts of assets that we have to take into account. We have SaaS-based applications that we're dealing with. We have VPNs that designed to marshal access into your network, but oddly enough, you can then go out of the network again. And into the cloud, and you can see all kinds of websites, and oh yes, the attacker can follow you back in again. So these are sort of things where VPN, well-intentioned, is only part of the puzzle. We have to look at this as a layered approach. NAC. Man, this drove me crazy when this first started coming out, but the idea here is very simple. You're able to, marshal access to the network. I worked in a bank back in the 90s, where they were doing it by port filtering on the MAC addresses for the entire bank. 55,000 employees manually setting the MAC addresses for this entire company. Let's just say that NAC actually was a breath of fresh air. But it didn't stop you from taking the system home and attaching to the internet and downloading all sorts of wonderful things, which I have had to live through in a couple of organizations. You have to address the risk. What is the risk in your environment? What are you trying to fix? Hello, come on in. All right. We have to look at it as reducing risk. Always about that, because otherwise we're getting lost in the minutia. We're getting wrapped around the axle on things that just don't matter. Back in 2003, the Jericho Forum was talking about deperimeterization. This was basically the forerunner to what we now know as zero trust. In 2010, John Kindervag, when he was at Forrester, came up with this term. This term is now, much maligned at this point, but it gets the point across. It actually got people to pay attention. And when you're talking about zero trust, you're talking about network zone segmentation, user management, all of these different components that we should have been taking care of all along. This is getting back to the core fundamentals. This is returning to zero, making sure that we go back and start addressing the things that we have neglected over time. So what does zero trust really mean? And unfortunately, there are so many vendors out there that are saying all sorts of different things, like, oh, you can be zero trust certified. No, that's not a thing. If you buy this box and plug it in, you're going to be zero trust ready. No, none of that works. You want to make sure that you're understanding what the messaging is. Zero trust isn't a game of increments. You are trying to make your environment incrementally more secure as you go along. It takes some organizations years in order to accomplish this, and I'll talk about that a little bit in a moment. You want to make sure that your messaging is on point. Because when you think you're saying something that makes sense, this is actually a campaign out of South Dakota in the United States a couple days ago. It's a very serious issue, but damn. You want to make sure that when you are getting your messaging across, you don't come across looking like a nincompoop. Because all of a sudden the entire internet is there and they're going to pop up and say, hey, how you doing? Zero trust really is about everything is on fire. That's the easiest way for me to articulate it. You want to look at it as everything is open season. Now, I said this before, but I'll reiterate this, where back in around 2003, or actually closer to 2004, I had proposed making all the laptops and desktops in our organization bastion hosts, and then exposing them to the internet. Yeah, they didn't like that at my company, but I didn't realize how far ahead of the game I was. It was just more of a case of I got tired of managing all of these zones that we had implemented, and I thought, there's got to be a better way to do this. You've got to make sure that you are extending out how you're going to look at security, because that original traditional perimeter is gone. In every organization, no matter how you slice it, it just doesn't exist anymore. And the more that I hear people saying, it's okay, it's inside a firewall, the more I tend to lose my mind. We want to make sure that we are addressing things in a correct fashion. We like to think of ourselves as environmentally friendly. I brought this one up before, I'll bring it up again. Don't reuse your passwords. The attackers know that we have opposable thumbs, but we really aren't that far beyond, ferrets. And we want to make sure that we're doing a better job. You have password managers, you have multi-factor authentication, you have biometrics, you have options. Because static usernames and passwords are no good. If you have a key with your house information or a picture of your family or something like that, and you drop it on the sidewalk when you're off to work, an attacker can come along and go, oh, free house. Go, open the door. Doesn't mean that's the right person coming through the door. Static usernames and passwords have really failed us. And data breaches are going to keep happening as we go along, because we need to address this in a more cohesive fashion. When we look at things like various reports out there, the Verizon DBIR, IDC research, things like that, 81% of breaches involved weak credentials from one report, and 70% involved compromised devices. Why? We want to make sure that we are doing a better job. Now, every time I give a talk, I talk about the types of data breaches. Informationisbeautiful.net is like eye candy for me. This particular slide here is from 4 years ago. This was data breaches 4 years ago. Then 2 years ago. Then Information Beautiful said, okay, we have to rejig how we're doing our presentation because nobody can read that mess. So they did this. That was 6 months ago. This was yesterday. We can do better. Or I'll see you in hell. At this point, I need a little bit of coffee. So when I was here last year, one of the things that I brought up was talking about the flaming sword of justice. This is the old way of doing security, where you would be, how do I get to know? We have a new project? No. We want to open this particular port? Yeah, no. Doing nothing to enable the business. As security practitioners, we have to be there to champion the business and help them get things done safely and securely. We need to make sure that we are part of the solution and not being relegated to, oh, they're just a cost center. We don't want to talk to them anymore. You know, you've had that conversation before. When you're looking at where your users are, it shouldn't matter where they're physically located. I have been a remote worker for over 15 years now. It's a bloody fantastic thing at times. But I should be able to have the same experience in a coffee shop in Toronto that I have in an office in Dublin. There really shouldn't be any variation. And that's why Zero Trust is a good thing, because you help build that framework so that the employees can operate within it in a safe and secure manner. So, there's some great examples out there. Google ran out their version called BeyondCorp. Now, this is how they got to their version of Zero Trust. This took them 7 years to implement. So don't lose heart if you are going down this path. If this is something you want to entertain, I'm all for it. I definitely am in favor of it. But it took them 7 years, so you can set that as a benchmark. They had an entire dedicated team to get to that point. Intel this is their version of Beyond the Edge. But this is good because both of these companies are showing, in addition to the likes of Cisco and others, how to get to a Zero Trust model by eating their own dog food. So why is this awesome? The simplest way is multi-factor authentication is the gateway drug. I always like to look at that as the gateway drug, rather, to Zero Trust. So if an attacker is able to get your device, they have to know your username, your password, or have physical access to it, but then they need the other factor, and they don't have that. So you're limiting the ability of the attacker to cause any sort of trouble. If they breach a database and they're able to dump all the information and have all your usernames and passwords, what they like to do is take them and run them against various other sites and see if they can gain access. And if they can, then they will just keep iterating until they have all the access that they can get. But if they have multi-factor authentication enabled on all these accounts, and I'm not talking about SMS, although that's not so bad. It's much maligned, but still better than a kick in the head. You want to make sure that you are limiting the attacker's ability to do what they need to do. You need more than the password. You need to be able to check the hygiene of the device that's attaching to your network. If you're doing bring your own device, that's fantastic. Go for it. Fill your boots. But make sure you are setting it up in such a way that you have a risk profile that is associated with your organization. What is the risk if somebody comes in with their own laptop? If you're using zero trust as an approach, you're using it going through a gateway, and the gateway says, okay, you have to be this level of patching, this level of security, you have to have a screensaver on, all these sort of things to make sure that you are a certain level to ride that particular ride. So when they get into the network, then you know that you have a certain level of trust that it's going to be okay. The best thing is you can build your own. You want to make sure that you're focusing on 3 key pieces. We all love our triangles. So users, devices, and applications. I always love talking about this one user database review that we did at a company I was working at. We went through, and there were 10 users in this particular database that had super user access that did not work at the company anymore. 2 of them had been gone for more than 5 years. One of them died 5 years earlier. And that particular person's account was used 2 years ago at that point in time during the review. So we're like, great, we have ghosts that can use QWERTY keyboards. This was a real problem because we had no way to track down who was using that particular information. This same organization also had default usernames and passwords on every laptop and desktop in the organization that was the worst kept secret you had ever seen in your life. I could call the help desk and I say, oh, what's the admin password credentials for the local on this particular device? Oh, here you go. No authentication, no checking who I was, but they thought, oh, well, you called the help desk, so you must be one of us. We got that fixed. When you're looking at getting to a zero trust type of organization, you want to look at establishing the user trust. You want to know who the users are in your organization. You want to know the service accounts. You want to know all these different components. You want to be able to gain visibility into the devices that are attaching to your network. What kind of activity are these devices doing? Are they making random calls out to a server in Shanghai and then moving a database from your network to their network because it's a backup protocol? Yeah, that actually happened in one company I was working at. And they're like, oh, yeah, no, that's been there for 8 years. I'm like, we don't have an office in Shanghai. Oh. That was awkward. You want to ensure the trustworthiness of the device. Is somebody coming in with Windows ME? Are they using Yellow Dog Linux from back in the day? You want to make sure that you're not accidentally introducing problems into your environment. You want to be able to enforce adaptive policies. If you have finance people that are only allowed to access SAP, whatever it happens to be, but they're not supposed to get into GitHub, you want to make sure that that policy doesn't permit them to do that. Because why? Why would you want access like that? I once worked at a financial corporation where I was able to access the mainframe, and I felt bad because I was playing around with it trying to get in. I went and turned myself in, and they said we didn't even notice. This is not good. As you build through these stages, whatever vendor you use, whatever solution you use to get to that zero trust iteration, it doesn't matter the vendors. You want to have it with a purpose. You want to have it as a goal, as something to strive towards. Because you have this as your ecosystem that you have to deal with. Identity access management systems, business apps, endpoint management, detection and response. You want to make sure that you don't have a really nice, shiny detection and response mechanism that nobody's looking at. We've all heard about a particular company in the US where they had spent all the money, they had all the toys, but there were so many alerts they just stopped paying attention. Because bad things are going to continue to happen. This is back in the spring, I believe it was. Yeah, back in May. Bluekeep remote desktop exploits were going to keep on coming. And they have been keeping on coming. We've seen just recently there was a discussion about a worm apparently that was going around as well. And I'm sure that's not a problem. So back in May, I ran on Shodan and I said, oh, have a look. Who do we have there? Oh, 2.3 million results. And rounding up 2.4. Okay. So I ran this yesterday. Now 3.8 million devices are running remote desktop, and I'm sure they're all perfectly secure. 3.8 million. Oh, wait, self-signed certificate. First result. I went through there. Oh my goodness. There is a certain, there's a certain provider in China that really should have a look at their stuff. But it's not only there. We have to look here in Dublin. Bluekeep is unpatched on that many systems in Ireland right now. To a lesser extent, we have Eternal Blue is vulnerable on 30 systems in Ireland today. There are challenges that we have to address when we're looking at zero trust. One of them is selling it into management. Because they see that and they go, oh, zero trust, that sounds so negative. All right, let's call it trusted access. Let's call it risk reduction. Whatever works to get the job done. Because somewhere along the lines, we lost our trail of dealing with the core fundamentals, of dealing with making sure we have log management, making sure that we are looking through at the users, network zone segmentation, all of these different core components that help build a secure enterprise. You want to be able to make sure that your policies make sense in a zero trust environment. One organization I worked for, we went through all the policies, and this was not a zero trust endeavor back then. This was back in 2008, I think it was. One of the policies had nothing to do with anything we couldn't understand. It said we had to be certified in a particular certification that made no sense. No one had ever heard of it. I went searching through, I couldn't find anything online until finally the person who had implemented it years earlier was still at the company and fessed up as to what it was. One night she was trying to get this all done. She had this one policy left to do, so she did a copy and paste on a swimming certification. And did search and replace on certain words to make it look like it was a security thing. Wow. When you're looking at a zero trust approach, you want to look at it as a game of increments. You want to go through little bit by little bit. Look at multi-factor authentication. Look at locking in your devices. Looking at all these things that may seem overly simple. But these are core fundamentals that somewhere along the lines we got lost and started chasing after, ooh, shiny, look at that, we got a 0 day. I don't give a damn about a 0 day anymore when I'm looking at databases that haven't had their quarterly patch cycle for 3 years. You know that happens because I've been in environments where it is. You want to look at user trust. You want to make sure I'm a big fan of repetition. Establishing user trust. Who are the users in your environment? You want to go through and discover what is on the wire. One organization I was in, we went and we did a scan of everything, and they said, okay, you have 30,000 plus devices on the network. We scanned it, there was 45,000. They couldn't tell us why there was all the other devices. You want to make sure you're going through and see what devices are trusted. What devices are supposed to be on your network? What are the untrusted ones? Do you even know? In that environment, we had no idea. We found a lot of devices that had not been patched in years. And they were in extremely bad shape. So once you find these devices, you want to bring them up to a level that is what you consider trustworthy in your environment. And this all goes back to that risk discussion. In your environment, what makes the most sense? What are you worried about? Are you making teddy bears or are you making centrifuges? You want to make sure that you're not reusing usernames and passwords. This is going to bite you in the ass every single time. And yes, this causes me to swear profusely. You want to make sure you're enforcing these policies. You want to make sure that you do not have a director of communications who's coming to you saying, I need wide open access and WebSense to attach to everything on the internet because I need to do research. And then 48 hours later, you're having to take the laptop away from him because it's riddled from a porn site with all sorts of malware. I'm like, good job, dude. Yeah, that was a fun conversation. When you're looking at your policies, what is making sense in your environment? Are you doing geo-blocks that you have to make sure I don't want country X accessing my network? If you're doing that, that's fine, but you have to understand that is only a small impedance. I used to do bogon filters on routers for the U.S. Navy, and when we put those in it, not as a serving person, I should say, putting these bogon lists on routers so that various countries couldn't attach to the network, but they would just route through other third countries, so it would just slow them down for a little bit. You want to make sure that you're looking at what are the grace periods. Like if you're having somebody that's logging into the network and that has been on the road for a very long time and you haven't patched your system to current, and you want to make sure you give them a chance to fix it before you're bumped off the network because, yeah, that's never happened to me more than once. You want to look at the applications in your environment and make sure you're marshalling access to them. Do you want some nitwit that's sitting in a Tim Hortons in Toronto, Canada, accessing your email? No. Probably want to make sure they're just from your company so that you have them marshaling through a secure gateway. Because static usernames and passwords are flawed. Back in 1962, there was a high-powered computing system called CTSS. Each student here had 4 hours per week where they could do their experiments. Some of the other students figured out they could actually steal time by guessing by incrementing through the user account IDs. So the professor at the time put on a password control. As near as we can figure out, that was the first time that this was ever implemented. This was a reactionary measure. IBM came out with a system the same year that had passwords, but even they say that this particular system beat them to the punch. This was a reactionary measure in 1962 that we're still dealing with in 2019. It is not secure. It is buying us time. Not a lot. And it shows that things like, there are reports out there, Google's own data went through and they found that using multi-factor authentication reduced the number of hacks. Why? Because if the attacker can't get in, they're going to go, screw this, I'm on to the next site. What can you do? Big fan of repetition. Establish trust in your users. Track the user devices and their trustworthiness. Enforce risk-based security standards. Don't just go, oh my God, I read about it in the news. When they let me write articles, you should be concerned. Enable secure access from your applications one at a time. Don't do everything at once. Because if you go, oh, I'm going to just click it all and go live today, guess what? That never works, especially when you do it on a Friday at 4 p.m. I've lived through that. You all have too. So it has been an absolute honor for me to be back here again. I really do appreciate the opportunity to be here, even though I have to put up with, all sorts of guff from this guy. At this point in the talk, I'd like to invite you all to join my goddamn professional network on LinkedIn. Just search for Gattaca and you will find me. And at this point, I will say, if you have any questions, please let me know at your discretion. And I'd like to thank IrisCon. I'd like to thank Brian. Thank all. Yes. I locked up my jet lag finally. Thank you. My jet lag. Yeah. So I got 3 minutes if there's any questions, or if you just, I know I'm in between you and pints, so. Yeah, that took care of it. Oh, wait, we have a question.
Can you please go to people who are making the electronic medical records system?
Yes.
To tell them that has make it easier to use.
Well, oddly enough, and I'm not going to go vendory on you, we actually, at our company, we are actually talking with a lot of the EHR providers and things like that about doing this, and we do have a lot of healthcare customers that are enabling multi-factor authentication so they don't have to have this problem.
But not just that, because we are making the system centralized, so everything must be there, and we are taking like 20, 30 times to get some result, or to put some information, to find a reputation from 2 days ago, I must click like 40 times. So that they make that really simple for using, and because of that you will make also more secure, because you put everything that everyone can have access, and everyone put it, billing, those kinds of things. I think that help and medical professionals to have a time and to make it more secure.
All right, so what she's talking about is about organizations, particularly healthcare organizations, consolidating all their information in single repositories. Unfortunately, that is not specific to just healthcare. We see that in a lot of organizations, and making sure that you're managing that access in a sane, risk-based approach is really fundamental.
Yeah.
Any other questions before Pines? Nope. You're free to go.